It was 2001. I was attending a neighborhood potluck at the local park with my wife and our newborn son. Our friends were elated upon learning we'd had our first, and would be meeting Ashton for the first time that day. Everyone fussed over him and the adorable circular birthmark beneath his left eye, debating which of us he looked more like, and how excited their kids were to have a new friend. There were about a dozen of us that occupied 3 picnic tables. We had 3 or 4 coolers, a whole spread of different platters and trays that covered an entire table, along with burgers and dogs cooking on 2 charcoal grills. My cross-street neighbor, Fred, grilled, while everyone else talked, drank, and played games. Ashton lay in his carriage, which I parked in the shade of an oak tree next to the grills. I kept Fred company while he cooked, acting as a sort of sous chef and making sure his drink was always full. The park was particularly busy, and despite everything going on, I spotted someone who appeared to be watching our group, sitting alone at a picnic table about 10 yards from our spot. His clothes were sketchy, black pants and a heavy-looking hoodie that obscured his face. They were so uncharacteristic for a midday barbecue and made him very noticeable. The hooded man sat facing us with his arms folded across the table. I pointed him out to Fred, who acknowledged that something seemed off, but thought he appeared harmless. "Maybe he's meeting someone," I suggested, while pouring Fred a beer. Without any discretion, Fred turned and stared directly at the man. "Could be," Fred said, with disinterest, while flipping a few burgers. "Maybe he got stood up. We'll fix him a plate and make him feel a little better." I rolled my eyes at Fred's remark, unable to resonate with his unapologetic apathy. I couldn't ignore my instincts that were telling me this guy was here for another reason. Nobody else seemed to notice or mind him, and I didn't want to put a damper on the gathering, so I kept quiet about my apprehension. Despite being unable to see much of his face, I definitely felt the man's looming gaze briefly lock onto mine for a few minutes. After convincing myself he didn't have any good intentions, I decided to confront this particular individual. "Let me see what's up with this guy," I said softly to Fred. "It's those newfound parental instincts kicking in," Fred said. "They get a little wonky at first, just FYI. I started towards the man's table, but froze upon hearing an ear-splitting crack, a booming of shattering glass, and a crunching of metal. Everyone in the park stopped and stared at the parking lot, where a large tree limb had broken and smashed 2 cars. "The hell!" Fred exclaimed, as he set his spatula down and raced towards the scene. The tree limb had fallen onto Fred's car, which mine was parked next to, and partly covered by the massive branches. Throwing my arms up in the air, I released a "what the hell" of my own and followed behind Fred. Rachel was already assessing our cars when I arrived, shuddering upon spotting a few good-sized scratches and dents and a windshield crack. I expected Rachel to be as equally upset. Instead, she gave me a perplexed stare. "Where's the baby?" she quickly asked. I immediately pivoted, instantly noticing the hooded man had left his table and was beelining towards the grill. I broke into an all-out sprint upon determining the hooded man was after Ashton, releasing a boisterous "Hey!" that I hoped would deter him and get others' attention. What happened next took a matter of seconds, but felt like it unraveled in slow motion. The hooded man, wearing thick padded gloves, removed one of the grill's metal grates and grabbed its side handles. He turned to me once more before lifting the grill and dumping the red-hot coals into the carriage. A loud, hiss-like sizzle mixed with my baby's shrill, blood-curdling shriek, his screams only lasting 2 or 3 seconds before the carriage burst into flames. Grabbing handfuls of my hair, I reached Ashton's carriage. I could only scream his name and instantly knocked the stroller over with a firm kick. Glowing coals charred the blankets and pillows, and Ashton's smoldering remains spilled out, most of which were still on fire. The hooded man took off across the field while being pursued by Fred and 2 others. I could instantly tell that my baby was dead, whose stiff, crumpled form was completely doused in flames and produced a burnt, meaty aroma that filled my nostrils. I heard my wife's hysterical screams behind me, and I felt my legs give out as I collapsed in a heap. Rachel was inconsolable. She had to be sedated by the paramedics. I faded in and out, with most of time being between witnessing Ashton's murder and being taken to the hospital. It all felt like a blur. While waiting for an update on my wife, an officer came up to me and said they had caught the hooded man who initially escaped the park. I was brought to the police station, where I first laid eyes on him through a one-way mirror. He sat in an interrogation room. The man's appearance was grotesque, and he had appalling physical deformities. His skin was a light pinkish beige and littered with veiny, blotchy gray and black growths. He was completely hairless and had dark yellow eyes, whose right one was about twice the size of his left. I was met with repulsion and a boiling fury while gazing upon this murderous subhuman life form, whose windpipe I yearned to crush with my bare hand. After confirming I did not recognize him, detectives told me that he was being classified as a John Doe. The hooded man had no form of identification, wasn't showing up on any of the databases, and hadn't spoken a word. After getting assured that he wouldn't be released anytime soon, they asked a few more questions before letting me go, promising to provide updates on new developments. I returned to the hospital, where Rachel was still being treated for severe mental breakdown. I spent the night in the waiting room, mostly with my face buried in my cupped hands, replaying the day's grisly, life-altering events in my head. At some point I dozed off, and was awoken the next morning by a nurse. She brought me to the doctor caring for Rachel, who said my wife was in a deep state of catatonia. After being updated on Rachel's condition, I returned home to start arranging Ashton's services. No sooner than taking 3 steps out of the hospital, however, I was stopped by the same officer who'd brought me to the police station yesterday. He looked distraught, and I could tell he was dreading what he was about to tell me. "He's gone," the officer said sorrowfully. "Who's gone?" I asked with bewilderment. "The man who killed your baby. He somehow escaped last night. No witnesses, nothing on the camera, no sight of how. He was in his cell one minute and just gone the next." The hooded man was never found. Rachel made little progress overcoming her debilitating trauma, spending the next year in and out of psychiatric care. My life consisted of work, visiting her at the hospital, and going to bed. 2 months passed, during which things continued to gradually implode. Rachel returned home, but was on a cocktail of meds that barely seemed to help. She became a bitter, hostile shell of her former self, barely capable of functioning independently, and prone to sporadic fits of rage, delirium, or emotional episodes. Rachel blamed me for our baby's death, and made it her mission to keep me constantly reminded. I reached my breaking point with Rachel when she used a broken bottle to attack me during one of her episodes, slicing my arm and neck, which required over a dozen stitches. After that, Rachel was put into the mental care facility, and I decided to explore my legal options for ending our marriage. She could be looked after by her family, I thought. Most of them also hated and blamed me for Ashton's death anyway, even saying I was responsible for Rachel's mental breakdown. My boss's wife connected me with a divorce attorney to look at my case. When I met him at his office, however, he said something that took me completely off guard. "I've actually been expecting you, Mr. Williard," the attorney said while rummaging through his desk. "I have something here with instructions that I'm to give you on the 1st of September, which is today." He slid a yellow manila envelope in front of me, which had my name in large black letters. Inside was a light gray envelope that also had my name handwritten on it in red ink. "Who did it come from?" I asked awkwardly. "I only spoke to him twice. 1 year ago when he initially called, and then last night when he reminded me about today. He just identified himself as Mr. Doe. Sent me a large wad of cash to hold this for him, and that was that. Didn't ask any questions. That's sometimes how it goes in my business." The envelope's letter contained a vertical list of numbers, with other sets of digits, words, or letters beneath each one. The manila envelope held a white CD with "Watch in Order" written across its surface. I didn't even accomplish what I had come there to do originally, becoming completely sidetracked by this mysterious package. I ran the CD on my computer, which had a handful of video files labeled 1 through 5, remembering the disc said, "Watch in order." I opened the first file, and my heart stopped when the video began playing. Appearing on the screen was the deformed face of my baby's killer. The man who murdered my baby sat in a concrete room, wearing the same heavy hoodie and black stretch pants as he had that day. I would have pulled my computer off the desk and thrown it across the room if the shock of seeing his hideous face hadn't numbed me into a state of borderline paralysis. After fiddling with the camera, the hooded man leaned back and stared intently into the lens. "I'm so sorry, Jeremy," he said in a low, gruff voice, causing sharp chills to race down my spine when he spoke my name. "I really am so very sorry for everything, but you must understand why this happened. Let me start from the beginning." I took a sharp breath and struggled to maintain my composure, but felt compelled to continue watching. "My name obviously isn't Mr. Doe. It's Eric, and I'm from the year 2076. I know that sounds absurd, but you have something that will prove I'm telling the truth, which I'll cover in a little bit." The man, who identified himself as Eric, leaned closer towards the camera. "You know this was for a greater good, and doing this actually saved countless lives." I leaned back and stared skeptically at the computer screen, my intensifying hatred for this man clashing with the queasy uneasiness ushered in when he admitted to being the Mr. Doe from whom I received the package. "Okay, now that I've got your attention, here's where it gets complicated," Eric continued. "Some years from now, I can't get into specifics, a catastrophe is going to occur that devastates the world. Among the most adverse ramifications are a series of physical mutations that a portion of the population will undergo. As you can clearly see," Eric gestured toward his deformed face, "were known as defects and require special treatment to stay alive, like routine radiation doses and staying within certain temperature ranges, just to mention a few. Cases of radiation contamination and new disease outbreak originating from defects turn us into pariahs. This is where your son comes in. During these times, we call Ashton Williams the Damatiant. He was a renowned public figure, whose faction quickly rose to power in the Cataclysm's aftermath, feeding off people's manipulatable emotions and fear. Seeking a scapegoat amidst their promise of rebuilding, the Damache, as his minions are called, set their sights on the defects. They succeeded in generating enough widespread hatred amongst us, even going so far as to stage violent attacks and pinning us as the culprits. The video made me completely enraged. The Damachiant cited their attacks and our susceptibility to infect and contaminate people as grounds to start rounding us up into containment camps. We knew the risks we posed towards unaffected portion of the population and took great pains to isolate and care for ourselves. While researchers worked tirelessly to discover a cure, they actually came close, but the programs were discontinued without explanation. The camps had inhumane conditions. Many died from disease or malnourishment before the Damache began extermination. The things they did would make history's most heinous figures cringe. You'll see what I mean when you watch the other files. I lost everything in those camps, Jeremy. Doing this was the only way to reverse that, and in the end, the Damachiant's oppressive reign. I felt a lump form in my throat and held back tears, simultaneously empathizing with Eric, while still reluctant to believe his stories. Your son was ravenous for power. The Damaches evasively occupied territory, eventually starting a multinational war. They killed millions of defects, but those numbers pale in comparison to the tens of thousands of people who perished just in the war alone. A few tears streamed down Eric's face as he spoke. "It It's okay to talk about what your son would have become, since that timeline is being eliminated. As for why I killed him in such a gruesome manner, doing it at that exact moment and way was the only option to stably alter the timeline. My heart sank when I recalled that fateful day, particularly when the tree limb fell on my car. It was the perfect distraction. Did Eric know that would happen? Did he change time to make that branch break, knowing how immediately it would occupy my attention? Jeremy, I know you're probably having a hard time believing this. I would too, but think about how I just vanished from my cell. I'd love to explain how it works, but it's against the rules to directly reveal certain information. That's why I sent you this. There's clues for events that will occur in the future, which will verify this is very real. Think of it as a puzzle. It's actually quite easy once you figure it out. There's some considerable time between each instance, but don't worry, I'll send you reminders. I know you're hurt, confused, and angry right now, but please believe me when I say a great loss or tragedy is sometimes necessary to prevent something much, much worse from happening. After the video ended, I stared at the computer for what felt like hours. Tearing, perspiring, and trembling, I had no idea what to believe. After collecting myself, I watched the other videos, which were compilations of newspaper clippings, excerpts from news broadcasts, and raw footage depicting scenes of war and unfathomable carnage. They seemed to map out everything Eric described, mentioning the cataclysm, the defects, the Demache rise to power, and their imperialistic campaign. Headlines such as, "Experts, recovery will take years, over 10K new mutation cases confirmed, link between defects and contamination outbreak identified," and "Demache completes southern coastal occupation," caught my eye, while videos and pictures flashed on the screen that Eric's words did little justice in describing. I saw images of war-torn horizons and crumbling city skylines, explosions, scores of marching fighting soldiers, along with dead and dismembered bodies. The most disturbing scene showed defects performing hard labor, rooms with their bodies and severed limbs hanging from meat hooks, mass executions and graves, even some getting their deformities cut off or experimented on while they were still conscious. It didn't take long for me to deduce a robust, prominent-looking man donning black authoritative uniforms and a long overcoat, who I saw clips of making fiery speeches, getting paraded around while waving to the crowd, speaking with officers, other official-looking individuals, and transported by armed security detail. It was my son. Despite having his mother's eyes, Ashton bore an overwhelmingly striking resemblance to me. But what verified my son's identity without a shadow of a doubt was the birthmark still visible beneath his left eye. Despite the macabre prospects of the future, I was intensely proud of my son, which I suppose comes natural for any parent, until reminding myself that he would have turned into a genocidal warlord whose totalitarian regime appeared to deepen the world's state of ruin. I stopped watching after one scene of Ashton making a passionate speech when I noticed an elderly man and woman sitting in the background. They were huddled together and gazed upon Ashton, their faces containing conflicted expressions of admiration and obligatory supportiveness, along with disappointment, concern, and dismay. My jaw dropped, and I released a gasp-like yelp before abruptly closing the video. Rachel and I were that elderly couple. Experiencing a wave of smothering lightheadedness, I tried pouring myself a drink, only to violently regurgitate it while standing over the sink. Those videos looked so genuine, and I hated how everything Eric said was making sense. Had my son really been destined to become this monstrous tyrant? Was this some elaborate sadistic prank a deranged individual was orchestrating to gain pleasure at the expense of my suffering? I tried thinking of every conceivable explanation to not believe, but I couldn't be convinced. My attention shifted to the notes, series of numbers that meant nothing upon review. Remembering what Eric said, to think of it as a puzzle, I looked at the first set of characters. 9, 112, 1, 11, 77, 175, 93. "What are you trying to tell me?" I asked. "This must be something more to this." About 1 week later, I received an identical light gray envelope in the mail. It contained a handwritten letter, also in red ink, that simply read, 9112001, just reminding you. I spent weeks trying to crack the cryptic code, which consumed me for months to no avail. It would take me over 3 years to finally figure it out, when the next letter arrived. After finalizing my divorce with Rachel, I moved back to my home state and reconnected with an old high school sweetheart. We got engaged, were starting our own company, and in the process of purchasing a house. I was grateful to finally move on with my life, but despite getting closure on Ashton's death, I still kept the undecipherable letters. Christmas was 5 days away, and I returned home from gift shopping where I found another light gray envelope lying on my doormat. Despite immediately knowing what it was, the envelope's mere sight flooded my mind with memories of Ashton's screams, his burning carriage, and Eric's undeniable face. I shakingly opened the envelope to find another letter, which read, 12-262-004. "Do you believe me yet?" On the first letter, written 12-262-004, were the numbers 75891. This time around, however, I was more concerned Eric knew where I lived than solving this mystery. I was about to dial 911, but remembered when Eric said that he was sending me reminders and decided to play along, feeling certain this letter was the latest. I figured everything out on the date later, ironically while writing a final check to my divorce lawyer. It was the day after Christmas, and I had the news on while paying some bills. They were talking about a massive earthquake and tsunami that devastated coastal communities around the Indian Ocean. I was so distracted by the story, I almost put the comma of the check's numerical amount in the wrong spot. While stopping myself, I looked at the check's date, which read December 26th, 2004. Remembering I was anticipating something significant to happen, I grabbed the open letter and stared closely at the numbers. 12-262-004. Thinking about the mistake I almost made on the check, I rewrote the figure and shifted the second comma 1 digit to the left, so it read 12-26-2004. I did the same with the top number, going from 9112001 to 9/11/2001, which was when it became clear. They were dates. It was something the news anchor said that I happened to hear. The earthquake registered a 9.1 on the Richter scale. That drew my stare to the number beneath, 12-26-2004, which were 758 and 91. Then it came to me. 9-1 signified the earthquake's magnitude. I learned the quake happened at 7:58 a.m. local time, which I linked to the other number, 758. Solving 9112001 figures was even more unsettling. The date it translated to was obvious, and after doing some research, I deduced the other figures represented the first number of each aircraft involved. I started shaking when the reality of the revelation hit me, almost having a serious breakdown when I couldn't fathom any other way that Eric or whoever it was could have known this information. My perception of reality, space, and time was turning upside down, marking a day which forever changed my life. I still resent Eric for killing my baby, and I will always keep Ashton's memory alive, because I remember him as an adorable, innocent child who hadn't hurt or wronged a single soul. Having said that, I finally understand what Eric meant. I translated the last 3 numbers, 34-2-0112. became March 4th, 2012. 842,020 turned into August 4th, 2020. And 4,132,029 was April 13th, 2029. Despite the tragic nature of the events that already happened, I understood why Eric chose them specifically. They mostly happened by pure chance and could not have been predicted or prevented. Having said that, I've spent the last 15 years making vain efforts at determining what happens on each of those dates before the event unfolds, with hopes of preventing the tragedy. As expected, I received my next letter over 7 years later in a late winter of 2012. 342,012. I know you don't need the reminders anymore, but I sent this one just in case, was what it read. Under 342,012 on the original letter I received over a decade ago, 700 UTC and capital were written. On March 4th, 2012, a series of deadly explosions caused by an arms dump rocked Brazzaville, capital city of the Republic of the Congo. The blast started around 8 a.m. local time, which translated to 7 o'clock Coordinated Universal Time, otherwise known as UTC. That made sense. The most recent event happened this past summer. The next letter arrived the last week of July, which said 842,020. See you soon. Don't do anything stupid. I'll be watching. I obsessed over this and what it might mean, unsure how it pertained to the next event I expected to occur on August 4th. Beneath 842,020 on the original letter were the terms NH4903 and port, whose meaning I could only speculate until the actual event transpired. I'm sure most of us remember the explosion that happened in Beirut, Lebanon. Port signified where the blast happened, a port in Beirut. This one took me a while, but I figured out NH4NO3 was the chemical formula for ammonium nitrate, which caused the deadly explosion. There's a good amount of time between now and the last event, which should be on April 13th, 2029. After translating it from a numerical figure of 4,132,029, beneath it on the original letter, that I still have after all these years, the phrase 1997 XF11 and skin are written. I have no idea what they foreshadowed, and I probably won't know until the actual day. I've kept this knowledge of the future away from my then fiancée, who's my now wife of 14 years. We have a thriving company under us, along with a home and 2 beautiful children. The letters and their connection to Ashton's death are tied to a completely different part of my past that my family was not involved in and has no knowledge of, and I intend to keep it that way, until we met our new neighbor. They were a very nice couple from the Northwest that relocated for the husband, Corey's job. They have 1 child who's around the same age as my own kids, and they get along famously, along with a 2-month-old baby boy. Looking back, I think I understand now what the most recent letter I received meant. The name of my neighbor's newborn is Eric. Life in Frost Hollow has always been fairly normal, up until a few days ago. My husband and I had small issues and arguments, like any couple, but there was no sign of severe transformations that would escalate into such gruesome nightmare scenes. I always woke up early. The day this all started, I rose around dawn to see the muted gleam of an infant sunrise shining through the window. I looked over to Jack's side of the bed, but found it empty. It appeared unslept in, which I found strange, as he worked the night shift and would nearly always be home in bed by 3 or 4 a.m. But ever since he found our newborn daughter dead in her crib, he'd been acting strange, disappearing at random hours and occasionally bringing a friend home. The people he brought were always young, glassy-eyed guys that I'd never seen before, who often followed him around in an eerie silence. like ducklings following a mother duck. I made a fresh pot of coffee and got out onto the porch as the world came to life. The sun rose overhead like a burning angel, a fiery eye in the vast expanse of cloudless blue. I knew it would be another scorcher of a day, humid, sticky. I watched early morning joggers pass by. I wondered where Jack was. I pulled out my cell phone, checking to see if he had sent me any messages, but there was nothing there. I sat on the front porch, thinking about my fading youth. I had once had hair the color of summer sunlight, but now it was going gray. The small wrinkles around my mouth and eyes seemed to be lengthening and deepening every day. Everything in the world seemed to grow dusty and brittle, like one enormous sarcophagus. I felt certain I would never have another child, never see bright blue eyes staring up at me from that crib again. Far off down the street, there was a strange translucence rippling in the air, like burning heat rising off desert sand. It expanded into a perfectly flat wall. It cut across the trees, homes, and cars, and I squinted, realizing that it was coming nearer with every heartbeat. I thought it was some kind of bizarre meteorological phenomenon, some kind of heat mirage or humidity bubble. As it slowly crept closer, I got bored, pulled out my phone, and read the news. After a few minutes sitting and people watching, I went inside to make some breakfast. I ambled over to the freezer, looking inside for something edible, maybe some chicken tenders I could deep fry next to some eggs and toast. Instead, I found a decapitated human head, its open, staring eyes glassy and frostbitten. I felt a scream welling up in my throat as I dropped my coffee mug. It shattered, spraying drops of burning hot liquid all over my legs. The freezing mist slunk towards me like ghostly hands, obscuring the face's features for a long moment. I wondered if this was an extremely realistic mannequin head. I looked at the blue lips pressed together as if in an expression of disapproval, saw the ragged patches of black flesh at the bottom of the neck, and knew it was real. Frozen crystals of dark blood clung to the bottom of the head in a black pool, gluing it to the freezer floor and keeping it in an upright position. Between the lips, I saw a piece of paper. On the front, in black cursive, read the words, "To Laura." I hesitated for a couple of heartbeats, then snatched the note from the dismembered head. The lips refused to let it go at first, but I gently wriggled it from side to side. It came loose with a wet sucking sound. The moment I freed the note, a siren rang out from the streets, the volume deafening. It rose and fell in shrill waves for a few minutes. I saw the fridge tremble in front of me under the onslaught of such noise. Black mist slowly began to ooze from every surface. By the time it evaporated a few minutes later, the fridge looked like it had aged 50 years. Enormous rust spots covered the exterior, and the smell of rotting food was instantly overwhelming, like the rancid odor of roadkill putrefying under a burning sun. The rest of the kitchen seemed to have changed as well. Everything had grown old and filthy. The counters were covered in cobwebs and grime. Deep cracks ran through the walls, and the windows were all broken. Turning back to the freezer, I studied the mutilated head's features more thoroughly. It was a woman with raven black hair and blue eyes, probably in her early 20s. Who was she? How had she died? How had her head gotten into my freezer? What was that horrible siren? I unfolded the note, seeing Jack's flowing handwriting there. My heart felt like it stopped in my chest as I quickly scanned the words. "Dear Laura, if you're reading this, it means you found the head. It's probably a good thing, I think. There are some things I've kept secret from you and everyone else for a long time. I don't know when it first began, when this fractured piece of my personality gained control. It all started innocently enough, peeking in people's windows when they weren't looking, or stalking random joggers for days without being seen. It was always a rush to get away with it. Soon I would break into people's houses and rearrange their furniture. I'd hide a portable camera in the corner or on the top of a bookshelf to watch their reaction. How I laughed. As you can imagine, it was quite fun. Life doesn't have enough laughter, after all. It seemed like I was wandering across an endless desert sometimes. But eventually I would stumble across an oasis, a resting place in this never-ending life of shit. At least, that other piece of my personality did. You might not believe me, but the first time I killed, it was an accident. Perhaps it was fate sending the first pebbles skittering down the ledge that would inevitably lead to an avalanche. I had been doing my usual routine, breaking into houses, moving things around, sometimes writing satanic messages on the walls in blood. It was all to keep people on their toes, just for chuckles and smiles. But I still always kept my pistol on me. I had walked up and down the street, seeing the mail piling up outside one of the old colonial houses, surrounded by a grove of thick trees. I'd found the house empty when I scoped it out originally. It seemed perfect. So that night, I made my way inside. I remember hearing the front door unlock abruptly in the middle of the night. Tried to run towards the window in the bathroom around back, the way I had come in originally. But the man must have heard my footsteps. He came around the corner with a shotgun, his face beet red. He was screaming and hollering. I was crawling through the window when he started to raise the gun. The ringing sound as he pumped a shell into the chamber was like a scream from God telling me to awaken. At that moment, I knew it was kill or be killed. Before he could pull the trigger, I aimed for his head and fired twice. I remember the rush of pleasure as his face disintegrated into a puddle of blood and bone chips. After that, things started to get a little hazy. First, I thought it was a psychotic breakdown because something started wearing my face, following me when I went crawling through the neighborhood. Perhaps it's a part of me in some way, my true self. After all, murder is godly, the pure power of the divine, and killing in the name of God is always mercy, so says the Savior. Well, anyway, I'm rambling. It's time to finish up this letter before I start to sound crazy. We can't have that, can we? What will the neighbors think? The main thing to remember is, don't look behind you. I'll see you soon. I read the last line a few times before it sunk into my mind. Don't look behind you. It didn't make any sense. Then I heard the choked gurgling from the pantry closet. It started low, like the first rumblings of an earthquake. The door was left open a fraction of an inch, one bloodshot eye staring at me through the crack. It flicked quickly to the left and right, the pupil dilating. Insane. Jack? I whispered, feeling sick and weak. What's wrong? I slowly backpedaled towards the front door. The laughter turned into a gurgle, something that might have come from the lips of a drowning man. He flung the door open, his face pale and bloodless, trickles of dried blood covering his arms and hands. Under his fingernails, I saw clotted black gore. Translucent black shadows swirled around his face and chest, spiraling up in a vortex like a dark whirlwind. They shimmered all around him, distorting his features and seeming to increase in intensity by the second. Jack isn't here anymore, he hissed in a diseased voice. His lips split apart, revealing teeth that looked far too long and sharp. He's hidden beyond the veil, rotting under the floorboards. Even now, he tries to claw his way up. He stepped towards me, revealing a long butcher's knife in one hand. Its steel stained a deep scarlet. Fresh blood still dripped from the tip. "Stay away from me," I shrieked, glancing behind me. The town looked different now, the streets deserted. Dark shadows danced over everything, as if there was a solar eclipse. The entire world seemed to exhale, a low, diseased hissing that radiated from everything all around me. This strange monster wearing Jack's face continued moving closer, seeming to draw power from the changes. His eyes darkened in a flash, turning black and cloudy. The cyclone of shadows twisted around his body, moving faster, a curtain of darkness so thick it started to obscure his face. "My name is Friend," he gurgled, lunging towards me with the knife. I instinctively pulled away, stumbling back towards the open front door. I felt a cold pain radiating down my left arm, a slashing pain that made my vision turn white with adrenaline and shock. A slash opened up the top of my skin, fresh blood bubbling out instantly. I fell backwards through the door onto the front porch, smacking my head on the wooden porch rail. Friend slunk towards me, a hurricane of blackness with an eerie human pillar at its center. He stared down at me with a grin like a razor blade, letting fresh blood, my blood, drip off the blade and patter gently to the rotted, mold-streaked floor. I kicked forward with all my strength, aiming a blow at his knee. I heard something crack, felt the leg give with a sickening explosion of black blood. The flesh felt loose and spongy, almost boneless. Friend wailed like a banshee, his voice rising into an ear-splitting wail. He fell forward towards me, aiming the knife at my heart, a look of fury darkening his face. A gunshot rang out behind me. A perfectly round scarlet hole appeared in Fred's shoulder. He jerked, twisting and gurgling in pain. Black blood spattered my face and neck. Feeling as cold as dry ice, I rolled away as his body came down. The knife landed only inches from my chest. It quivered there, its tip stuck deep in the wooden floor. Friend's features changed rapidly in front of my eyes, dripping and melting. The mask of humanity he wore started to fall away, revealing a spinning black hole of a head with a single red eye in the center. Wounded and leaking blood the color of waste oil, he skittered away on all fours. His limbs were skeletal. He was crawling like a spider. His clothes stretched and tightened around his changing, bulging flesh. Breathing hard, I turned to look at my savior. I recognized the withered old face of my neighbor, a man we all called Bones. He had no family that I'd ever seen, and lived a solitary life, almost like a hermit. I had talked to him a few times, been invited into his home even. His walls were covered in the taxidermy heads of animals, black bears and bucks and moose that he had killed. Crossbows, guns, and hunting bows of all kinds had lain scattered over nearly his entire home. He was an outdoorsman at heart. "Bones," I whispered in a choked voice. "Thank God." He shuffled forward, a small, very thin old man with a sunken bird chest. His giant rectangular glasses magnified his eyes to the size of dinner plates, and a white wizard beard hung down to the center of his chest. Jack and I had often joked that he looked like a character from Duck Dynasty. He holstered his pistol around his waist before reaching down a trembling hand and helping me up. "Something's happened," Bones said grimly. "When the siren went off, I was looking outside, just smoking and sipping some black tea, and I saw it happen. Everything started sputtering and shimmering, and this thick black mist rose over the streets and houses. When it finally blew away, I saw this." He waved a hand outside for emphasis, motioning at the apocalyptic scene. The streets heaved in great cracks and fissures, as if an earthquake had rolled through the town. The houses looked like they had survived a nuclear apocalypse. The windows were all shattered, tiny glass shards littering the ground like splinters of diamond. The roofs were peeled away and rotting, with enormous holes eaten into the center of most of them. Something like spider silk covered the dilapidated walls of most of the houses on the street, formed in symmetrical webs that rose 2 or 3 stories high. Behind me, the radio suddenly turned on, the lights flickering overhead. The power all along the street flashed on and off, the street lights outside strobing in an erratic frequency. Something like a metallic shriek ran out through the radio speakers. Bones and I jumped, turning to look backwards at the old radio lying on the kitchen counter. "This isn't the real world," a man screamed over the radio. I immediately recognized the terrified voice of Jack. My heart dropped into my stomach. "Don't believe anything you see here. The anomaly is spreading, Laura. I know you can hear me. I'm sorry for everything. Listen, get out of this. There are a few things you need to remember. First, you should know there's a gateway to this place. Portals that lead back to our world. You can recognize them by the blinding white light radiating from them. It might be a bedroom door, a window, even a kitchen cabinet or a box. They form randomly throughout the anomaly and are highly unstable, often lasting for only a few seconds. If you find one, take it immediately. These are our only ways home. Second, the entity here can take the form of any person or animal, but you'll know them by the shadows that surround them. To kill them, you want to go for the crimson eye in the center of their face. Third, there are places with food, water, supplies. They will look like dilapidated gas stations with the name Hell's Market on them. They're safe places where the things on the street don't roam. Don't stay in there too long, though, or you might see Hell. He doesn't like visitors. "Jack, where the hell are you?" I screamed at the radio, running over and shaking it like a crying baby, hearing random pieces inside the old gadget give a metallic rattle. But the speakers only gave a hiss of static as the radio died in my hands. A million thoughts seemed to run through my head at once. Was Jack still alive? Why had his voice come on the radio? Why had his writing been on the note? Bones came up behind me, putting a small hand on my shoulder. "We'll be fine," Bones said. "Jack's a tough guy, but we need to start moving. We can't stay here forever. We're gonna need to find supplies. Everything here is trashed." "It could be worse out there than it is here," I argued. "Why do we need to keep moving? We could barricade ourselves inside and wait for the police and the military and—" "Lady, you're living in a dream world," Bones said coldly, his magnified eyes turning into owlish slits. "We don't know how long we're gonna be here. You don't even know where Jack is. You have zero supplies. Zilch. You could barricade yourself somewhere and slowly starve to death, but that wouldn't help us much." His words made me think. I nodded. "Fine, but we should grab some food and water first," I said glumly, my head spinning. I felt sick and tired from all of this, yet the feeling rose in my chest that I hadn't seen anything yet. Bones gave a faint smile, the corners of his lips twitching as he watched me. I went over to the kitchen sink, turning it on. For a long moment, nothing happened. There was a burping, gurgling sound deep down in the pipes. They clattered and shook as if thousands of rats were sliding through them. The faucet burbled and hissed, frothing dark water. Finally, it spat out a gout of thick scarlet blood all over the rusted sink, squirming with dozens of writhing maggots. I gasped, backpedaling, the smell of iron and rot from the rancid mess sputtering out of the faucet in waves. Repressing an urge to gag, I reached forward and slammed the handle down. "Yup, that was expected," Bones said grimly. He looked around with a blank expression on his face, as if this was nothing more than a stroll in the park. At that same moment, the lights overhead flickered one last time and died. The cracked and broken street lamps outside went dark simultaneously, at least those few that still worked. I went over to the fridge, opening the door. The nauseating smell of rot exploded from the room, hitting me in the face like a slap. I gagged, seeing clouds of black and yellow mold growing over dried, twisted heaps of decaying food. The milk had become a soupy mess in the container, with black tendrils growing along the sides of the exploded jug. I slammed the fridge door shut. I ran over to the front door and stuck my head out, inhaling sweet, clean air. Bones followed slowly behind me, seemingly unsatisfied. "Don't look like we're gonna get any food or water here," he said. "My place ain't any better. When the siren hit and the black mist came, it changed everything. Ed at it, as if time had been turned on fast forward. By the time the fog was gone, my house was a wreck. The food in the fridge was all rotten sludge, and the cans in the pantry were ready to explode. My guns were all rusted heaps of junk. The crossbows twisted and strings snapped. Some of them had little black spiders building webs on them." "So how'd you get the pistol?" I asked, curious. He looked at me like I was an idiot. "I had it on me when it happened," he said slowly, as if speaking to a mentally deficient child. I nodded, looking around for a weapon I could use. In the living room, I found a metal baseball bat that Jack had brought home years ago. Like everything else, it had been eaten away by the ravages of time. Streaks of dark rust covered the length of it. I swung it a few times, feeling that it still felt structurally intact. "Let's go," I said, following Bones outside. We headed deeper into civilization, towards the downtown area with restaurants, gas stations, and grocery stores. The sky above had no stars, no sun or moon. It swirled in a dark blue hurricane, meeting in a black eye at the center. The cyclonic cloud peeled away like an old scab. Some pale light came, casting enough into a psionic light. I saw pale, dirty faces disappearing into the alleyway, and ruined homes, many of them apparently of children. "I saw 'em too," Bones muttered, holding his pistol tightly at his side. "They look like pictures of kids at Auschwitz I've seen, starving and filthy. Where's their parents, you think?" I shuddered to think about it, but if this place was sucking random people in, just making them disappear from the world, what if it was spreading, like a cancerous tumor hidden under gauze? I had nearly forgotten about Friend, the strange, shape-shifting creature who wore Jack's face, but he hadn't forgotten about me. We were passing the burnt-out hulk of a tractor-trailer when his shadowy face shot around the corner, staring at us with Jack's face. He had eyes like two burnt holes, black and smoldering. His body was a strange combination of spider and human, the thin limbs ending in sharp points. Fine dark hairs like needles covered his arms and legs. The bullet wound had apparently already healed. Black blood had crusted on the surface of his shirt and pants. He didn't hesitate. He attacked. He swung an insectile arm at Bones. I screamed, seeing it all happen in slow motion. The limb went straight through Bones' heart. Bright red arterial blood immediately began flooding out as he looked down in shock, still holding the pistol in one hand. He gurgled, dropping the gun and falling forward, dragging the arm down with him. I had the baseball bat in my hands. With all my strength, I swung it at the creature's head. It made contact with a fleshy thud. The soft, yielding flesh of the fiend cratered under the impact. Friend made a soft hissing sound as the wound bubbled and danced, as if a nest of mice were about to emerge. I leapt for the pistol. A choking sound gasped from Bones' trembling lips. The adrenaline rush made me feel no pain as I hit the hard, cracked road, rolling as I landed. I felt the cold metal of the pistol grip under my hand. I raised it, feeling the stab wound Fiend had given me earlier rip open again. Fresh streams of blood soaked my clothes as I fired, dripping from the long slash across my arm. The tip of Fiend's head exploded, the body transforming before my eyes into a black, spidery humanoid with a single spinning red eye in the center of its pointed skull. Dark blood, the color of asphalt, leaked down its naked, glossy body. It had no mouth or nose that I could see, but fine silvery hair covered its joints, its arms, and legs. The eyes widened in pain as it stared into the barrel of the pistol, one blade-like arm still caught in Bones' chest. I remembered the transmission that had gone through the radio, and I aimed at the center of that spinning eye. "Why do you keep taking Jack's form?" I asked Fiend, the gun feeling heavy as it trembled in my hand. "Why just him?" "I can take the form of any who are part of the Church of the Final Rapture, those who have given their souls to the dark presence here," he hissed cryptically. He jerked forward, trying to bring his other blade-like arm up towards my neck in a quick, slashing blow. I instantly fired, pulling the trigger over and over again. The first of the bullets pierced his eye. I saw a blinding explosion come from the center of it, like a flashbang, radiating light the color of an infected wound. Orange, the color of pus, spun around bright reds and necrotic blacks. I stepped back, crying out. I instinctively brought my hands up to cover my eyes. When I could see again, I found only a smoking crater in the spot where Friend and Bones had stood. Gray smoke hissed from the center of it. I knelt down, seeing a dark, jelly-like substance covering the jagged patches of concrete. I quickly realized it was flesh, though whether human or alien I couldn't say. Shell-shocked, I stumbled over to Bones' melted pants, feeling around his waist until I felt the cold metal of an extra magazine. I had emptied all the bullets in the gun, fighting Friend. To my dismay, I realized Bones only had one extra magazine. Feeling sick and weak, I stumbled away, heading towards downtown, hoping against hope that I would find some solace or answers there. I was wavering on my feet like a drunk woman. As I got closer to the center of town, I found dead bodies hanging from the lampposts, many of them mummified or skeletal. I wondered how many people lived in this hellish world. I heard crying ahead of me, far off in the distance, and saw a girl kneeling before the body of a young woman. The corpse looked fresh, the tip of the demon woman's black tongue poking out through her stiff blue lips. The young girl's wails tore at my heart. The girl was wearing rags, tatters of a shirt and pants that were covered in streaks of what looked like dirt and blood. Her face was grimy, her eyes were big and blue. She looked up at me suddenly as I drew near, panic twisting her small face. She reminded me of the baby I had, the one who had died of crib death a few months earlier. My daughter had the same big blue eyes as the girl here. I looked around the destroyed world, seeing there were more spider webs covering the ruined buildings here. "Little girl, what are you doing here?" I asked. She grabbed at my shirt, pushing her small face against my thigh. "They killed my mommy," she wailed, trying not to look at the hanging corpse. I hugged her. "Who did? Who killed all these people?" She looked up, surprised. "How do you not know? It's the Church of the Final Rapture. They're trying to spread this..." She waved a dirty hand around for emphasis, wiping tears from her bloodshot eyes. "They think if they can spread the bad place far enough, then it will lead to the final judgment, and Jesus will come back, and good will finally win. But first, they say they need to kill a lot of people and make the battle happen." She shook her small head. "They're crazy, a bunch of religious nuts. Mommy always said so, and she was right. Look what they did to her." "What's your name?" I asked. "Marion," she said in a small, diffident voice. I helped her to her feet. "I'm Laura. You can't stay here forever, Marion. There are bad things here. Is it true there's a way out of here? A doorway of light or something? Have you seen any?" "I caught a glimpse of one once. It was beautiful, like looking into a rainbow. I thought I could hear singing." Her eyes got distant and far away. I took her hand, urging her to walk forward, away from the corpse of her mother. "So what happened?" I asked, trying to keep Marion talking. "I saw it, but by the time I found Mom and told her, it had evaporated." We turned a corner. Looming there overhead, we came face to face with what had been making the webs. My first thought was that it was some cross between a horse and an insect, the height of a small child and over a dozen feet long. It had the body of a struggling old man in its insectile jaws. They jutted out like the pincers of a stag beetle, with wicked serrated edges. 2 bulbous black eyes emerged from the side of its head, the size of baseballs. They didn't appear to have any lids. They stared at us, unblinking. I saw myself and Marianne reflected in those black orbs, as if they were an obsidian mirror. The pale chitinous shell of the creature shimmered with rainbows as it turned in a blurring motion towards us. Its snout was rounded with 2 nostrils. Stringy, blood-flecked mucus constantly dribbled from its eldritch face, falling down from its nose and mouth. The hundreds of long, skittering legs moved in rhythmic, peristaltic waves. The old man continuously kicked and punched at the monstrous face, but the abomination didn't seem to notice or care. Blood dribbled from his toothless mouth, and deep slashes crossed his chest, stomach, and legs. His lips and fingernails took on a faint bluish cast as its black eyes focused on us. Frothy bubbles of clear saliva started dripping from its flexing pincers. With a primal reptilian hiss, it threw its head to the side. The dying man soared through the air, smashing into a concrete wall with a blood-shattering thud. "Stop!" I cried instinctively, raising the pistol and firing. Marianne screamed, running behind me and hugging my legs as the dark juggernaut ran at us. The first bullet caught it in the neck, but the thick black plates of scale deflected it easily, leaving only a series of fine cracks running down its torso. I kept firing, aiming for its face. The second one hit it in the right eye, which exploded like a water balloon full of blue blood. Its wailing intensified until I thought my eardrums might explode. Half blind, its body slithering towards us like a snake, its many legs driving it forward. I jumped to the side at the last second, but Marianne wasn't so lucky. The creature's massive pincers wrapped around her chest, grabbing her and lifting her into the air. Deep slices appeared in her rags as she cried, pleading for help. I inhaled deeply, aiming for the abomination's face, hoping I wouldn't hit the girl. The last bullet in the magazine pierced its other eye. It exploded. The creature dropped Marianne to the ground, wailing a stream of whistling shrieks. I grabbed her by the hand, lifting her off the ground. "Run!" I hissed through gritted teeth, pulling her forward. Up ahead, I saw lights illuminating a store. It was the only building with electricity that I could see. I found it strange. As we got closer, I saw the sign, Hell's Market. The insectoid creature's agonized screams drew other skittering monstrosities. They crawled out of their side streets and alleys, their strange horse faces and insectile jaws working furiously as if tasting the air for prey. I remembered the rules on the radio when it had said the markets were a safe place. I ran through the doors into a building that hadn't decayed like everything else. I felt crisp air conditioning. The glass here was intact, and row after row of cold drinks and ice cream and frozen meals stretched out before us. It looked like a regular market, but in the back I saw a doorless threshold with stairs that led down into a shadowy basement. I shuddered as I looked at it. Outside, the creatures had stopped at the front door, their bulbous eyes staring intently at us. "Are you okay?" I asked Marion, looking at her injuries. The creature had left 2 long slices along the sides of her chest. They bled freely, soaking her tattered rags in fresh streaks of scarlet. She nodded, silently, tears running down her rounded cheeks. We quickly grabbed drinks and snacks, chugging sodas and energy drinks and eating candy and beef jerky. I didn't realize just how hungry I was after nearly dying so many times, and Marianne looked like she hadn't eaten in days. I was staring out the front glass, looking at the creatures waiting there for us with hungry and bloodlust gleam in their eyes, when I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs at the back of the store. Marianne grabbed my hand tightly. "I think something's coming," she whispered in terror. Through the dark threshold, I saw a woman looming nearly 10 feet tall. The left half of her body was decayed and rotten, mummified and gray, like everything else in this world. The right was beautiful and young, the skin pink and healthy. Behind her, I saw her dragging a man's body, wound tightly in razor wire, the sharp edges biting into his skin. I instantly recognized Jack. "Jack?" I asked, stepping back towards the door. "See your husband?" Hell hissed in a shadowy voice. She threw the trembling mass of bloody flesh at my feet. Jack screamed, kicking and twisting. "Get out of here," he whispered through gritted teeth. "I'll help you." "Did your help cause this?" I asked. Hell looked between us with a sadistic grin, the living part of her mouth splitting open. The dead part cracked, the dry skin ripping and showing blackened teeth underneath. Jack nodded. "The Church of Final Rapture. Yeah, we tried to spread the anomaly, to end all suffering, to cause God to notice us again and come back." Hell laughed at that, a sound like grating metal. "Foolish men. You shouldn't have played with things you didn't understand." Jack's eyes grew big. There was a moment of clarity as he met mine, motioning towards the back door at the back of the store. "I'll do what I can," he said, "with what the Church has taught me." He closed his eyes as Hell drew near, her heavy footsteps shaking the store. She lifted up one giant naked foot, lifting it over his head, holding it there like a guillotine blade. It came down with a crunch. The door at the back of the store started to vibrate and shimmer with white light as Jack died. I heard singing from it. Grabbing Marianne's arm, I pulled her towards it. A large, rotten hand came out, grabbing at my hair. I felt myself pulled off my feet. Like a rabid animal, Marianne ran forward, sinking her sharp teeth into Hell's wrist. I felt the grip release, my back smashing hard against the floor. The wind was instantly knocked out of my lungs. Grabbing Marianne's hand, we crawled towards the door, only feet away. Beautiful, angelic singing resonated through it, growing louder as we got closer. Hell shrieked with fury as we crossed the threshold, disappearing into the light. Everything dissolved in the blinding radiance, and for a moment, I felt warm and free. I found myself back home with Marianne, the sun outside bright and clear. The freezer was still open, the dismembered head staring blankly at me. Marianne was gently crying, cradling her bleeding chest. All the agonies and wounds I had suffered instantly started shrieking, grating on my nerves. Sickened, I stumbled outside and threw up, trying to forget the nightmares and the broken bodies of that strange anomaly. Father Calbasas stopped at Dunkin' Donuts before going to St. Mary's Church of Lynn that morning. He was a Catholic priest, but he had a sweet tooth, or, as he said to the barista that morning, "Oh, pardon my sweet fang, but I might have an extra squirt of that caramel syrup in my coffee this morning." Sweet fang was a slip that the baristas didn't care about because it was Lynn, Massachusetts, 5-something in the morning, and English was not their first language. Nobody knew if Father Calbasas was a Nordic kind of pale, Swiss, or a Swedish kind of pale, but he seemed to hail from some country where paleness is a quality of the majority populace. Nobody knew if his accent was German or Transylvanian, but it was something similar. Some accents sound all the same to Americans, but the Dunkin' coffee on his breath was proof of his becoming a part of Lynn. He carried his cold brew down the aisle of St. Mary's. It was so gray outside the church that he felt he had woken up before God did. Tap, tap, tap went his shoes, working their echolocation to the altar, where he bowed and veered left to enter his office. He lit a candle at his desk. He liked candles more than using the electric lights. He sipped his coffee while reading from a book on theology and waiting for the sun to rise. His office was something akin to a captain's quarters to him. It was decked out with shelves of books on theology and world history and decorated with religious relics, certificates, and photos of him and his fellow priests. There was a picture of him and his grandmother back home who had lived to be 107. There was a picture of him and a drug addict, a 20-something-year-old girl who he had helped on a spiritual journey of sorts. He made phone calls to her every couple of weeks and checked in, and she was doing well. There was a photo of him at a baptism for quadruplets. He looked delighted in all of these photographs, but his pale and gaunt draconian features betrayed him. Physically speaking, he was a paradox because he simply looked too ghoulish to be a priest. He sat down at his desk because he wanted to get some reading done before the 7:30 Mass. A thud made him turn his eyes away from the text and towards the ceiling. "Hark the herald pigeons sing," he said to himself. He blessed what he thought were pigeons with a chuckle. He delighted everything that lived, and he liked finding different aspects about different creatures to delight in. He appreciated how some pigeons cooed, despite how humanity discarded them. He always decided to give them greeting glances when he happened upon them in the parking lot outside of St. Mary's. He liked the pigeons cooing, and, in turn, he liked the seagulls' perseverance. When he found a spider descending from the ceiling of his office one afternoon, he cupped it in his hands and carried it outside. "Don't let the pigeons make a meal of you, little friend," he told the spider, then let it down into the turf of the grass along the sidewalk. And how did he treat the ultimate creature? The one that cooed like pigeons when it prayed. The one that found a reason to preserve. The one whose heart sometimes seemed to be dangling above the precipice of hell by one cobwebby string. He treated his fellow man kindly, whether he saw him in church or not. A louder thud came. "Huh," Father Calbasas said, looking up from his text again. "That's one big person." He looked back down at his desk with his eyes treating his Dunkin' cold brew the same way they had treated a mystery potion. There came another thud that made the priest raise his eyebrows. Then there came a great creaking from above that made the rest of the church shiver. Father Calbasas stood up. He looked up at the ceiling, and his voice was quite the injury in his eyes. But the boards of the ceiling seemed sworn to a new secrecy, or had they been so frightened that they had lost their tongue? He maneuvered around his desk while keeping his eyes up on the ceiling the whole time. He wandered out of his office and out into the main body of the church. It was still empty, but less gray, for precursory sunlight was touching the stained glass windows and just shyly lighting the church's interior. He shuffled down the aisle with his head back and his eyes up. The roof sounded like the groaning hull of a ship. It was so great that Father Calbasas quickened his pace to the exit of the church because he thought the roof might collapse in on him. He was letting out a "what?" when the sound of a giant bell creaked open this morning. It seemed that the bell's signal echoed within the shell of the atmosphere. Father Calbasas hurried out and down the marble steps at the front of the church, while the bell's signal droned lower and lower until its sound finally ceased. He appeared utterly baffled. He shimmied into the empty parking lot while the employers of the bank across the street filed out to find the source of the ringing. Again, a bell boomed out in the morning, but the thing was that St. Mary's bells were retired. They hadn't been rung for decades, not since the 70s at least. As far as anyone knew, only seagulls frequented the bell tower, at the top of St. Mary's, nesting and leaving white droppings, but never ringing the giant bells. It rang again before the second sound could settle down. Father Calbasas could just make out the startled chatter of the bank employees across the street, until their voices drowned inside the metallic roaring of the bell. He spun around in the parking lot and looked up. He gasped. There on the gable, at the bell tower, was the silhouette of somebody, tall, muscular, hairy, a hominid of some sort. Its arms were lanky and long enough to reach into the bell tower. Because of the sun's triumphant rising, however, whatever stood on St. Mary's roof was only visible as a silhouette. Father Calbasas' gasp mimicked the bell and continued on until it echoed out of existence. The silhouette was black as ink in front of the creamy orange-yellow morning light. Why, the thing was blocking out the sun itself. The bank employees started screaming across the street as the thing on St. Mary's roof rang the bell again with a janky but mechanical jerk of its arms. The screaming of the crowd across the street below must have agitated the black mass atop St. Mary's roof, for it started ringing the bell in greater succession. It jerked its arms back and forth more quickly, and now the great bell set all the little bells within the bell tower to panic. Father Calbasas would have sworn he heard the thing hooting underneath the agitation of the bells, but before he could zero in his ear on the barely audible hooting, the sounds of sirens scared the thing away. It left while the bells radiated their metallic echo into Lynn. He kept his face in a gasping expression while watching the thing slide down the roof and disappear behind the church. He noticed how tawny the thing was with hair, like bristles on a ruined paintbrush. It was covered in hair. This was the last thing he noticed about it, though. Father Calbasas took a step deeper into the parking lot. Oh, how the black mass had disturbed his pigeons. He needed to go and chase it until he remembered the crowd of people across the street. He turned around before he could continue deeper into the parking lot, and he saw how the people huddled together. Even the bank security guard had an unsettled expression on his face, while the women clung to him. The bells had ceased to echo when Father Calbasas crossed the street. He put his hands out and levered his arms down in a calming motion, like a conductor quieting the band. "It's all right, everybody. The thing has ended. The thing has ended." "What was that thing, Father?" asked the security guard in a thick Bostonian accent. How strange it was to hear a Bostonian conveying fear. "Well, it was quite big," Father Calbasas said, sounding sarcastic. "I think we can all come to an agreement on that." "Oh, somebody has to catch it," the old bank receptionist squealed. "Christ, Father, what the hell was it doing up there ringing the bell?" the security guard asked. His face was red and seemed about to pop with sweat. A police car pulled up and parked on the curb of the sidewalk outside St. Mary's. The cop hopped out of the car and stood beside Father Calbasas, making the two of them immediate partners. "It was a man," the old bank receptionist shrieked at the police officer. But before the officer could inquire further, the security guard blurted out, "I wasn't no man, hell no. I saw that thing, officer." "Thing?" the officer inquired. "Bastard must have been 10 freaking feet tall," the security man complained. "I saw it, officer." All the employees cowered. They took turns looking up at the bell tower in front of the yellow morning sky before looking back into the huddled horde they had formed. What a sour hollandaise sauce was that sky. The police officer turned his attention to the calmest member of the bunch. Father Calbasas widened his eyes when he saw a call for responsibility in the officer's eyes. The priest cocked and tilted his head as if his skull was a bingo machine, rotating to the winning number. "I guess you saw it too, Father?" the policeman asked. "Just a shadowy version of the thing, Your Honor," Father Calbasas said, matter-of-factly. "And it was quite hairy. Oh, and tall, like he said." "These crackheads are evolving," the police officer said, while shaking his own head. "Oh, no, sir," Father Calbasas said, hunching towards the police officer and speaking in a low voice. "See, I've assisted in the rehabilitation of a few of 'em crackheads in my day, and you see, well, I don't think any of them got so hairy and tall because of their habitual bane." "Well, then, how do you explain this, Father?" the police officer asked in a low voice. "Oh, my God," the old bank receptionist shrieked. "It was a giant monkey." "Was it, Father?" the police officer inquired. "It was monkey-like, Your Honor," Father Calbasas said, after a moment's hesitation, but he didn't sound quite sure. "You guys might want to keep an eye on the police logs tomorrow," the officer chuckled. "I'm gonna take down everybody's statement. I'm sure I'll be able to find you inside. Eh, Father?" "Yes, I'll have a rendezvous with a bygone cold brew in there," the priest prophesied. The conversation that the priest and the police officer had was inconclusive. They conversed in his office, and the inquiry only seemed to cement the situation into a more bizarre molding, for the police officer believed the priest the most amongst all the other witnesses. Father Calbasas went into detail how he had heard the thud and heard the ceiling cracking before he hurried out to see the thing ringing St. Mary's bells. He left out the detail of the thing hooting, because he still wasn't completely sure of it. "By the way, Father," the police officer said, shaking the priest's hand, "you called the judge Your Honor, although I don't think you'll ever be seeing one." "What do I call you?" "Tommy, sergeant, officer, your fellow man," the police officer said with a twinkle in his eye. "I'll get out of your hair. As I understand, you've got mass soon." "I'd rather you in my hair than a giant monkey thing," Father Calbasas joked. The two chuckled, and the police officer left, leaving the priest alone in his office with an empty Dunkin' Donuts cup on his desk. Coincidentally, the bells began to ring when he hung up the phone. How politely did the priest treat the nuisance? He didn't even bother to go outside and try to see the thing, for it was the same time as was the other day when the same thing had happened. He knew what it was, but he didn't know why it was so attracted to the St. Mary's Church, to his church. The rest of the day carried on as normal, but an escalation occurred the following Monday morning when Father Calbasas was waiting for the barista to make his cold brew. There was a television in the corner of the room playing the news. Authorities are still investigating the bizarre incident, but still no one can explain what creature was on the security footage of the grocery store, the news anchor said while the footage cut to the footage of a grocery store aisle. It showed shoppers hurrying away from a hominid with orange hair, twice the size of the fleeting shoppers, as it ransacked the shelves of food. Because the footage was from above, only the head and shoulders of the creature were visible, and its visage was covered in orange hair, but its fingers were somewhere between purple and black. They were very long, thick fingers. 3 Stop and Shop employees have quit following the incident, and Stop and Shop has made an official comment about the situation, saying, "We here at Stop and Shop appreciate our customers of all different shapes and sizes, but do not condone this kind of behavior. We apologize for the disruption at our Lynn location on Washington Street the other day," the news anchor reported. This coming mere hours after another bizarre incident at St. Mary's, where the thing was reportedly sighted ringing the church bells before fleeing. "Get yourself on the nearest Mayflower and come up here," Father Calbasas said into the landline phone in his office that morning. Dr. Milton Kellogg arrived the following Wednesday afternoon, carrying his bags and suitcases into St. Mary's, which then smelled like the cardboard-tasting communion wafers and candles. Father Calbasas was in his mass attire, a white robe with a green stripe down the center, when the doctor hurried up the aisle. "I came as soon as I could," Milton croaked. He had a nasally voice that so desperately wanted to be British. "But I didn't come all this way for you to try to convert me," he said, when coming to a stop before the altar. Father Calbasas' face became lit with amusement. He seemed to be waiting for the opportune moment to laugh. "Old friend Milton, how are the alligators?" "Business is booming," Milton said, despite the disinterest in his voice. "The Dianne skull is a real draw for the little children." "Just as long as you keep them away from the real hungry living alligators," Father Calbasas teased. "Oh, have you seen the movie Lake Placid?" "Yes, I did, Tobias, and in my opinion, it's ridiculous." "I hope we have time to go and see a less ridiculous movie when this whole thing is over," Father Calbasas mused. He still seemed very amused. Milton squinted behind his glasses. His acquaintance's amusement always perplexed him. "This whole thing, your request was quite urgent, Tobias. I wish you had done some explaining over the phone. Perhaps I thought you wouldn't have come. You must instill some better belief in me, Tobias," Milton sighed. Even his sigh was disinterested. "Well, why don't we start with what you saw?" Father Calbasas went on to describe the events of the bell ringing. Milton opened up his laptop, and Father Calbasas directed him to the footage of the thing in the grocery store. "I don't believe it," Milton said, in a kind of elongated gasp. "Well, you better believe it, my friend." "No, I don't believe it," Milton said, while stroking a non-existent beard. "It seems to be a Gigantopithicus blackie." "Uh-huh, and what is that?" "An ancient species of primate that went extinct in Asia 200 years ago, give or take," Milton said. He lifted a pointed finger and started tracing his equations in the air in front of the laptop screen. "The aspects are unmistakable. Its size and orange hair. It's a distant relative of the orangutan, but it's supposed to be an ancient relative, not living, you see. I've seen it ringing my church bells. What did you call it again?" "Gigantopithecus," Milton answered breathlessly. "It was supposed to have died around the time that humans were leaving Africa." The both of them went silent, remembering their previous conversation and friendly debates. The silence was agreeable because both subconsciously knew that today was probably not the appropriate day for a friendly debate. Besides, either one already knew that they couldn't sway the other with their opinions. Finally, Father Calbasas broke the silence. "Some things come back from the dead, Milton." Another silence came while they rewatched the footage of the grocery store. "Are there any zoos around?" Milton asked. "The Stone Zoo, but this is far away and they do not have any orangutans or anything of the sort. Could it be a new species?" "No, it's Gigantopithecus, all right," Milton mused. "What makes you so sure?" "Because you called me for help, Tobias." The utterance of his first name made Father Calbasas flinch, but he remained composed. "But can you riddle me this, Dr. Kellogg?" Father Calbasas waved his fingers while beginning to pace in the area between the pews and the altar. "So, what if it is a Gigantopithecus? Well, that's a mystery in of itself, but why did the creature, not once, but twice, ring the bells of my church, the bells of which no one in Lynn are old enough to remember ever hearing?" "Well, I'd say monkey see, monkey do, but you say those bells haven't been rung in years." "Decades," Father Calbasas hissed. "Pongo pygmatheus, that's orangutan to you, have been recorded quite comically, driving golf carts, using saws, and doing very human things," Milton explained, although there was an air of uncertainty in his voice. "Oh, Milton, if you saw how urgently this thing rang the bells," Father Calbasas explained. "What are you suggesting, Tobias?" that this Gigantopithicus, was doing more than monkey see, monkey do, Father Calbasas explained. I theorized that this was an act of desperate spiritualism, a monkey in search of God. Milton was so enamored by the priest's monologue that he was fearful of the church organ coming to life in a melodramatic song, but it didn't, so he listened and hoped that no church music would begin playing. Father Calbasas went on. You're of the party that believes humanity springs from the apes, right? Yes, Milton said, a little amused, but Gigantopithecus is not an ancestor of mankind. He is man-like, Father Calbasas shrugged. He made shrugging appear so much like a move in a musical. When in your books did ancient man develop religion, or did we search for it? Is this Gigantopithecus ringing the forgotten bell to, shall we say, see if God responds to him? Shall we say, to summon God? Does it want to learn? Tobias, you are thinking fantastically. Why, of all things, Milton, would the Gigantopithecus come to my church and ring the bell? Father Calbasas emphasized, and although Milton was a staunch atheist, it made him go silent. I'm going to ask you a question that I fear to ask, but I must ask. Is the Gigantopithecus dangerous? A 10-foot-tall primate, Milton sighed. Generally, orangutans are not aggressive towards humans, but those are orangutans. Little is known about Gigantopithecus. Put one in the modern-day civilization with cars and traffic and pedestrians out for walks, children playing on playgrounds, children playing outside during recess. We might not desire experimenting with waiting just to see how Gigantopithecus behaves with modern man. Father Calbasas thought of screaming bank employees. He thought of how the shoppers in the grocery store fled. I mean, Gigantopithecus has the teeth of the gentlest herbivore, but again, primates have been known to become territorial. Is my church in danger? If this thing returns and causes a panic during Mass, there's no telling how it would react to human panic, Milton answered. The two became silent again. It would have been a good time for the church organ to come to life and provide some kind of daunting melody, for they didn't want to fill the silence with more theories, or worse, fill it with predictions. What do we do, Milton? We find it, we learn about it. And what do we do if it comes back at the wrong time? Father Calbasas said, rephrasing his question and making it sound dire. How do I protect my flock? Do you mean firepower, Tobias? You know guns aren't allowed in church, Milton teased. He didn't smile, though. How long do you plan on staying in Massachusetts, Doctor? Father Calbasas asked, after deliberating in himself and his mind. Now, Milton began, I plan on staying a lot longer than I initially planned. Father Calbasas passed the background check, and on Saturday night he wasn't getting ready for Mass in the morning, but he was sawing off the barrel of his newly purchased double-barrel shotgun. There was a bandolier of shells hung up on the wall, while statuettes of Mary held their arms out wide, as if shrugging in surprise. While sawing off the barrel of his new shotgun, he thought of that comment Milton made about an orangutan using a saw. The sound of the saw teeth biting into the barrel filled his office while he worked by candlelight. The barrel toppled onto the floor and let out a hollow clang that was similar to the bells. Father Calbasas held up the sawed-off shotgun and examined it, examining how the orange candlelight reflected on its black barrel. I dub thee Little Flock, he told the shotgun. He then turned around to the lever-action rifle and considered sawing off the buttstock and barrel as well, but was unsure. It was a Marlin Model 336, and he had already decided to name it David, after the David and Goliath story. Had anybody ever pitied the giant? This he contemplated while babysitting his new purchases in his office. He remembered how urgently the black silhouette rang the bells. It gave him a sense of dread, but also a sense of pity. It was a sense of sympathy. Was it a sense of sympathy? This thing, it reminded him of the abominable snowman from the 1964 Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer film. He used to watch it every Christmas when he was a boy in his snowy village, and the abominable snowman always frightened him greatly. Father Calbasas trekked into Lynn Woods the following Sunday afternoon. Milton wore a Davy Crockett hat with a raccoon tail attached to it. He also wore a beige safari uniform with the pants tucked down into his combat boots. Father Calbasas wore his black cassock. He looked as ghoulish as always, but he looked alert. "Ah!" Milton yelped when Father Calbasas drew Little Flock from within his cassock. Luckily, he did this while they were deep enough within the Lynn Woods. "Do you have any idea how illegal that is?" Milton asked, but Father Calbasas didn't care. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," Father Calbasas quoted, but this did not assuage Milton at all. "Did you not bring a gun, my friend?" "A gun?" Milton squealed. "Yes. Don't you use one of those revolvers when tiptoeing around your alligators?" "Yes, but that is in South Carolina. I have a revolver, not a sawed-off shotgun. We aren't Bonnie and Clyde, Tobias." "I believe he used a sawed-off rifle, but his sweetheart used a sawed-off 20-gauge. That's not the point," Milton squeaked. "We have a Gigantopithicus to catch, Milton. This is for protection," Father Calbasas said. Milton looked to his side to see the priest cradling the shotgun in his arms, the way someone might carry a little lapdog against his chest. "There's an old legend about pirates who buried treasure in these woods, Doctor," Father Calbasas mused, amongst the crunching of his footsteps. "They say he died in an earthquake. Thus, the term Dungeon Rock is now a sort of tourist attraction in the woods. Dungeon Rock. It's a stony crevice in the earth underneath a wedge of boulder," Father Calbasas went on. "I know about this only because a youngster I befriended used to crawl into the crevice to shoot up. It's dark and damp. A real den down there it is." "Have you been down there before?" "I did. I went with the youngster one night to go and collect her discarded needles when she finally decided to turn over a new leaf. I tell you this in confidence, of course, but I am proud of her, and this forest brings up memories. She studies at the North Shore Community College now. Oh, but I haven't seen her in a while." Milton simply listened to the priest while they walked. In fact, the more they walked, the more they remembered their friendship, and the less they remembered the Gigantopithecus. They laughed about the first debate they had had at Cambridge. Their friendship was built off of disagreement, but also a kind of respect for each other. They both knew that the other possessed a propensity for learning. It was what they talked about while Milton put vinegar on his fish and chips, and Father Calbasas dipped his fries in tartar sauce. "Oh, I love tartar sauce," Father Calbasas moaned, as the two scaled the hill in the woods that led to Dungeon Rock. Milton threw his hands up as the two stopped. The gesture made Father Calbasas regret his wild profession of love for tartar sauce, but the forest didn't move. No crows flew away, but they remained in the branches where the sun had beaten through in lime-colored flakes. "Do you see this, Tobias?" Milton whispered, while reaching into a tuft of long orange hair. He grabbed the tuft as gently as he could and pulled it out of the tree bark like wool. "The hair of a Gigantopithecus," Father Calbasas gasped. Milton put the tuft of hair up to his nose and sniffed. "The sample is fresh," he said, snapishly. "Look around for prints or more tufts of hair." Father Calbasas started doing so, but the earth was too dry for prints, and they were in the hills near Dungeon Rock, so there was too much gravel within the dirt. He unfolded his arms and drew his shotgun while the two crept into the opening in the forest where Dungeon Rock was. "There it is," Father Calbasas said. "The entrance to Dungeon Rock. I don't think the species could squeeze in there." "But we can," Father Calbasas said, gripping Milton's arm when the Gigantopithicus emerged out of the trees. How yellow were its eyes, its face, a purply bruised visage. It opened its mouth and roared, displaying yellow canine teeth and flinging spit into the air. Father Calbasas pulled Milton into the entrance of Dungeon Rock just as the Gigantopithicus swiped at the two of them. They nearly tumbled down the wooden stairs and would have been digested by the dark stomach of Dungeon Rock, but Father Calbasas caught himself. He held on to both Milton and his shotgun. The two caught their breath while listening to the agitated breathing of the Gigantopithecus. Its breathing amplified into a hoot and then into a shriek. Very little sunlight leaked into the stairway in Dungeon Rock while the two sat listening. They mastered their footsteps on the stairs, intaking the primal odor of the Gigantopithecus while it continued to complain in discordant hoots and shrieks above the entrance to Dungeon Rock. They could smell its breath, and it smelled like swampy pond water. Its body odor was doggy, almost as pungent as a cow. They reminisced about its arms. Oh, its biceps! Had it indeed grabbed a hold of Milton, there was no telling what would have been done to the paleontologist. They must have hunkered down in the stairway for 20 minutes while waiting for the beast to amble away. Oh, and the heartbreak Father Calbasas felt while replaying the scene in his head. Although this species had perhaps tried to do something significant by ringing the bells, it simply could not be allowed to. Those were not its bells to ring. Such thoughts ran through Father Calbasas' mind while he held on to his friend and his little shotgun. "Tomorrow night, Milton," he whispered, "we must bring the Gigantopithecus to its end." "Tobias, you must understand. We caught it off guard." "It's too dangerous," the priest hissed in a whisper, his voice being carried down the stairwell of Dungeon Rock. "How angry it was when we entered its domain today. How angry will it be when our Lord doesn't answer to its baying at the bells? What rampage will be sent into when it's denied by God? Then it will truly become the ape that it was always meant to be." The ending notes of the priest's mini-speech echoed down the stairway, being carried down into the dark stomach of Dungeon Rock. "Then it will truly be the ape it was always meant to be. To be. Milton took a deep breath through his nose. He was too frightened, even still. "It will ransack the streets of Lynn," the priest hissed. "It will overrun vehicles. It will turn its victims' skulls into bells." Milton was too abhorred to speak. The plan was simple. Milton was stationed in the bell tower, while Father Calbasas waited at the altar with his shotgun and lever action. All the candles in the church along the pillars were lit, with the altar being the most lit area of the church. He was curious, the plan also acting as an experiment, for there was a plate of communion wafers and a goblet of red wine on the altar. Would the Gigantopithecus accept the Eucharist? Did the Gigantopithecus perhaps, on some level, possess a misty understanding of ceremony? Father Calbasas wanted to know. The father flinched at the first tolling of the bell. He blinked and reminded himself of his mission. He looked down the long aisle between the pews, looking out the church's open door and imagining it would be big enough for the Gigantopithecus to crawl through. He swallowed his dread and kept his eyes on the doorway as another tolling sounded. He imagined how scared his friend was, but he reminded himself again that this mad idea had a purpose. For some time, Father Calbasas listened to the bells from above. They weren't ringing the way the Gigantopithecus had rung them. They clanged more meekly, not as urgently. The bells ceased. Silence fell upon Lynn. Father Calbasas retained his composure when the thing came in from the street. It crawled up the marble steps outside and bowed its head while crawling to fit through the doorway. But it got on its two hind feet when it entered the aisle. It was no longer just a split-second episode in Linwood. It was no longer a silhouette. The Gigantopithecus stood there, yards away from the priest. Father Calbasas inhaled as calmly as he could through his nose and tried his best not to show emotion while sharing eye contact with the Gigantopithecus. Its yellow eyes seemed wetted by the candlelight, its woolly coat of orange hair covering its body aside from a plate of purple muscle on its front side. Its mouth and nose had a protruding nature. It looked alarmingly more like a human than an orangutan. Oh, but it was so unnaturally tall. It looked alarmed to see the priest, or was that its natural visage? Father Calbasas tried to keep his hands from shaking while he picked up and offered the plate of communion wafers in the air, which now was a battle of scents of the Gigantopithecus and the warm scent of the candles. "The body of Christ," he murmured, in a voice he hoped only God could hear. The Gigantopithecus just stared blankly at him. Was there some kind of recognition in its yellow eyes? "Is this what you want, Father Calbasas?" asked the Gigantopithecus. But it didn't answer. This didn't mean yes, but it didn't mean no either. "If it is, I'll bring it to you in the woods every Sunday evening." The Gigantopithecus didn't understand this either. It blinked and sniffed the air while looking at the priest dead on. It cleared its throat in a low grumble and curled back its lip in perhaps some kind of an attempt at communication. It sniffed the air further, and somehow Father Calbasas knew it was trying to smell the communion wafers. Was there a sense of familiarity being tied to the air between them? The Gigantopithecus stepped forward, beginning its descent down the aisle. Father Calbasas kept the plate of communion wafers in front of him and waited. "The body of Christ," he repeated in a voice that was clearer than earlier. He gulped. The Gigantopithecus was extending out its long arm. It was actually reaching for the plate, and it made Father Calbasas' heart throb so much that he could have smiled. The Gigantopithecus swatted the plate out of Father Calbasas' hand. The air was a glitter of communion wafers for a second, while the plate clanged to the floor. It roared while diving at the altar. Father Calbasas ducked just in time and grabbed his shotgun. He crawled away from the altar while the Gigantopithecus turned around. The shotgun blasted out a tolling of its own. The Gigantopithecus roared in anger, but the buckshot had created little violent polka dots along the side of its purple chest. It closed its eyes and continued roaring. Father Calbasas fired a second time. He could hear the flesh being ripped off its shoulder when the buckshot splashed across the air. His whole body trembled while unlocking the shotgun and letting the barrel down. The thing was charging at him. He dove into a pew before he could reload Little Flock. The shotgun shells which he held went rolling away, rolling down another pew and another. The creature's fists shot down and cracked one of the pew benches in two. Boards and splinters erupted into the air. Father Calbasas climbed over a pew, catching a glimmering brass shell on the floor. He picked it up, shoved it into the shotgun, and flipped the barrel back up. The Gigantopithicus regained its footing just in time, and brought both its fists up with the vigor of an executioner's beheading axe. Father Calbasas pulled his finger down on all the triggers all the way. The Gigantopithecus threw its head back immediately when its forehead caught the brunt of the buckshot. It had been so close to Father Calbasas that its head had caught every ball in the volley of the round. Its deflating roar came in conjunction with the wet crack its skull made. Father Calbasas watched the Gigantopithecus make one final expression while it fell down backwards. Its mouth was open as if it wanted to let out a final hoot, a final prayer. The church echoed with the thud its falling body made. Father Calbasas panted while watching streams exit gracefully out of the wedge at the top of its forehead. The wound reminded him of the entrance to Dungeon Rock. Milton hurried into the church while Father Calbasas watched the violent liquid pooling out of the Gigantopithecus's skull. "Thank God you're all right," Milton said, sounding like he was breathing for the first time. "'Tis quite the time to thank God," Father Calbasas said, while turning around to face his friend. "Did it reach for the communion wafers?" "There was a moment where I thought it was," Father Calbasas answered, matter-of-factly. He held the shotgun out limply, now that it was empty, suddenly remembered he was holding it, and was startled by it. "Oh," he laughed, "I better go hide this before the police arrive." "Yes, you better," Milton murmured. He was a bit astonished at his friend's resilience, or was it a lack of surprise? It made him start to wonder if his friend had actually performed the rites of exorcism before. Part of him really didn't want to know. Gunshots aren't the most abnormal thing in this part of the world, but they're very abnormal from inside St. Mary's, so the residents surrounded the church and notified the authorities. "Gunshots?" Father Calbasas said to the police officer, while Milton was finishing dragging the Gigantopithecus's body down into the church basement. The priest was stalling the cops on the front steps outside the church. "You know, now that you mention it, a loud noise did wake me from my nap, but there might be mice in the church rafters. Don't tell anybody. By the way, do you know any good exterminators, Your Honor?" They had used ropes to pull and drag the behemoth primitive along the floor until they let it tumble down the basement steps. Milton wanted to bring it back with him to South Carolina for further study without the pesky government involving itself, but there was something that unnerved him about the Gigantopithecus, even though it was dead. It picked at his mind and turned his consciousness into a scab while he stood over the woolly orange body of the thing, Father Calbasas distracting the police outside. An ape that, as Father Calbasas had stated, presented an act of desperate spiritualism. Was Milton's heart breaking, or was his mindset evolving against itself while he loomed over the body of the Gigantopithecus? He certainly had never scaled any religious buildings to ring a bell. He couldn't remember any time in his life where he was enthralled in an act of desperate spiritualism, but this ancient ape was. So, Milton and Father Calbasas readied the body for the remaining hours of darkness that came after midnight. He got a rental car when the sun came up, and the two struggled transporting the cadaver into the rental car. They shook hands, and Milton drove away, besides a couple of incidences on the highway where Milton felt the car was going to lift forward into the air to balance out the 1,000 pounds of ape in the back. The commute went smoothly. He spent a couple of days transporting the body in his homemade lab near the alligator farm. He spent even more dissecting and preserving the body, but it was when he got to the head that a familiar fear entered him, and it led him to call his old friend in Lynn, Massachusetts, in an act of desperate spiritualism.